Okay, now let's take a look at the nervous system from the cell at the cellular level. We want to take a look at how does an individual neuron work. Well, first, the neuron, again, that's the nerve cell. That's the individual unit of the nervous system. There's about 100 billion of them in the brain. It is there are a lot of neurons in our body. There are also what you call mirror neurons, which essentially which help us in terms of imitation. So when, the monkey see, monkey do idea is that we have neurons in our brains that essentially respond to what we see, again, allowing us to imitate, which is important because imitation is an important part of learning. The glial cells in the nervous system, they're not neurons, but they are a support system for the neurons. They help nourish the neurons. They provide support for them. For example, the myelin insulates the axon. We'll talk about that in a minute. So these are examples of some glial cells. Okay, let's talk about the basic structure of the neuron. If you take a look here, you have the cell body, which contains the nucleus. This is the power center of the neuron, and that is essentially what it is. So in other words, the cell body, kind of like like you think of the cells in our rest of the cells in our body, we have the cell body for the nucleus as well. But this is the cell body for the neuron. As you can see here, you have these branches here attached to the cell body, and those are dendrites. The dendrites are the locations on the neuron which focus on receiving information from other cells. So these dendrites branch out, making connections with other cells where they receive messages from other cells. So a neuron can receive messages to the dendrite. The dendrite of the neuron can receive the message and essentially tells the neuron what to do. It can receive a message from another neuron. It can receive a message from, like I say, a skin receptor, for example, too. So the dendrites receive this information, and when the neuron then is sending a message, the message will travel along the pathway called the axon. And the axon of a neuron actually can be very long, because you might have a neuron which has a very, where the dendrite of the neuron gets stimulated, and the message needs to be sent to the part of the body that's far away. And in that case, you need a longer axon to essentially send the message quickly, rather than have a bunch of different neurons connected to each other. Have one neuron where the message gets sent all at once. So the nerve impulse travels from the cell body across the axon to the terminal branches here at the end. And if you see these little protrusions here, these are called terminal buttons. And these terminal buttons release neurotransmitters to send the message to the next cell. I mentioned the myelin sheath, which surrounds the axon. These are glial cells that surround the axon, and they function to protect the axon as well as to insulate it, to keep the message and speed up the transmission. So let's talk about how neurons work. Now, right now, I want to remind you we're talking about the action of an individual neuron. We're not talking about the nervous system. We're not talking about one nerve to another. Right now, we're just talking about the individual neuron. Let's start with when the neuron is at rest. It's called its resting potential. Negatively charged inside, positively charged outside. So when the neuron is at rest, essentially it's not firing. With the idea of firing, the idea is not sending a message. Okay, so the cell is not actively sending a message, it is at rest. When it is at rest, it has a negative charge. Well, how does it have a negative charge? Well, in your cellular fluid, in your body, you have sodium, you have potassium, and you have chlorine. You have them in ions, dissolved in the fluid? Well, the sodium ions have a positive charge. The potassium ions also have a positive charge, and the chlorine ions have a negative charge. Well, when the neuron is at rest, you have a greater concentration of the chlorine ions inside the neuron and a greater concentration of the potassium and sodium ions outside the neuron, which keeps the interior of the neuron is in negative charge relative to the outside. And you have a membrane that keeps it apart. The semi-permeable membrane keeps apart the negatively charged fluid on the inside and the more positively charged fluid on the outside of the neuron. How is it kept apart? Well, the membrane separates it, but it is what you call semi-permeable. So there are essentially openings within that particular membrane that can let some of those positive ions in. And letting in those positive ions is an important part of the process towards the neuron actually becoming active and sending a message. So we said before, the neuron, when it's at rest, it has a negative charge inside. Well, what happens when you start having positive ions from the outside the neuron start coming into the cell? What happens if some of those openings in the semi-permeable membrane start opening up? And now you've got positive ions coming in. Don't forget, it's negative on the inside, positive on the outside. The positive is going to be attracted to the negative. So the positive ions, the sodium and the potassium, are going to start coming in. Right? And this is a process called depolarization. When the neuron is depolarizing, it is becoming more likely to fire. Because again, when the neuron is at rest, the intracellular fluid of the neuron has a negative charge. When it starts becoming a little less negative, a little more positive, well, now we're getting closer and closer to the point where it actually will fire, actually will send a message. So the positive ions of sodium and potassium begin to enter into the membrane. These channels open up, letting some of these ions in. The electrical charge becomes less negative. So far, by the way, the neuron has not yet fired. It is just depolarizing. The positive ions are coming in. While you might have positive ions coming in, you might also have positive ions going out. You might have both. Remember, if the neuron is at rest, it has a negative charge inside. Well, you're going to have some positive ions coming in, but you're also going to be able to push those positive ions out to maintain that resting potential. So you have the chlorine ions entering the neuron and the positive potassium ions being let out. This returns the neuron to the negative state, making it less likely to fire. The electrical charge itself becomes more negative. So basically, what you have is when the neuron is at rest, you've got these depolarization and hyperpolarization happening all the time. You have the positive ions coming in, you have positive ions coming out, negative ions coming in, and so on. So basically, you're having this activity going on, basically maintaining this resting potential, so the neuron is essentially ready to fire, ready to send its message. But these are incremental changes. The depolarization is incremental. However, if the neuron is stimulated and leading to increase of the membrane opening up, more depolarization is going to happen. More of those positive ions are going to come in. And what happens when enough of those positive ions come in? Well, now you have what is called an action potential. The action potential is where the neuron actually fires. And this is essentially when the neuron is now going to transmit the message, going to send the message. When the depolarization reaches this, what is called the threshold of excitation, the action potential is triggered. So in other words, the depolarization starts happening. More positive ions coming in. The cell is becoming less negative, less negative, less negative. When it reaches a certain point, when it reaches a threshold of excitation, boom, the action potential happens. The neuron fires. And what's happening during the action potential is the what are called voltage-gated channels in the membrane open up to let in those positively charged sodium ions. And these sodium ions, they come in to one channel. When it comes into one channel, it triggers the next gate to open, and then the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one, like a domino effect, all the way across the axon. Once that action potential occurs, it triggers those terminal branches, those terminal buttons at the end of the axon to start releasing neurotransmitters. And this is where the neuron is now sending a message to the next cell. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here is a close-up of what it might look like with the action potential. As you can see, you have the semi-permeable membrane, the gated channels opening up, letting the positive sodium ion in. Again, increasing the positive charge of the cell, triggers the next sodium channel to open up. Sodium comes in all the way across the axon. Again, and after the sodium ion comes in, positive potassium ion goes out. Again, restoring the cell back to its normal resting potential, the negative charge. And this restoration from the neuron back to its resting potential, back to its resting state, is called repolarization. So after the action potential has occurred, the potassium ions are pushed out. You know, you're now increasing the negativity, the negative charge inside the cell, and the neuron is back at rest. So that's basically how the process works. I want to kind of clarify a couple of things when it comes to the action of the neuron. As I said before, the action potential occurs only when the depolarization reaches the threshold of excitation. So if you take a look at this chart over here, you can see that the resting potential, the charge of the neuron is at negative 70 millivolts. Okay? When depolarization occurs, it starts to become a little bit less positive. When it reaches negative 60 millivolts as the electrical charge, the sodium channels open up, and the positive ions rush in, and boom, you've got your action potential. After the action potential occurs, you have what is called an absolute refractory period. Neurons do not fire continuously. They do not fire and keep on going. When a neuron fires, any neuron in your body, when the neuron fires, it cannot fire immediately again. It has to go through a resting period in order for it to essentially bring it back to its normal resting potential. And that's called the absolute refractory period. During this period, immediately after the action potential, the neuron cannot have another action potential. It's already released it cannot have more than one. Now, however, there might be a pretty strong stimulus that is causing your nervous system and this particular neuron to keep on firing. But as I said before, there is an absolute refractory period, so it cannot fire continuously. It can fire repeatedly, but it cannot fire continuously. So it can fire again, but only after the absolute refractory period has passed. But it can fire during what is called the relative refractory period. During the relative refractory period, the neuron has not quite reached its resting state yet, but it is at a point where if a strong enough stimulus hits it, it can fire another action potential. So basically, after firing, a neuron cannot fire for 1,000th of a second. So when we're talking about a resting period between action potentials, we're not talking about like a minute and a half. We're talking about a very short period of time, but it still must be there. Another interesting aspect of the neuron, about the action potential in particular, is that when the action potential is triggered, it's either going to have the action potential or it's not. The neuron is either at rest or it's having an action potential. So it's going to be, one or nothing. The neuron is active or not. And once initiated, it can't stop. So once the action potential is started, it's, as I said, it's like a domino effect. One gate opens up, it triggers the next gate open up, the next one, and then the next one, all the way across the axon. So the action potential, once it starts, it can't be stopped. Finally, an important part here is that always the neuron will fire an impulse at the same strength. You cannot have strong action potentials, weak action potentials, and medium-sized action potentials. They're all going to produce the same strength impulse. So, it's going to be fired and that's it. Fired or not fired, it's going to be fired. It is going to have an impulse of the same strength. It can't be stopped once it starts. But if each neuron produces an impulse always at the same strength, then how are we as human beings able to tell the difference between weak stimuli and strong stimuli? Well, the more intense the stimulus, the more frequent the action potential. So while you can't have one neuron firing a lot, you cannot have one neuron firing strongly. You can have multiple neurons firing in sequence. And in this case, you're going to have the strong effects from it, to deal with intense stimuli.